Good evening, everybody. How are you? Thank you all for coming. We're here to have fun. My name is John Wooding. I'm Emeritus Professor of Political Science at UMass Lowell, and I'm from England. So I got inside knowledge on this, right? So a group of us, actually back in 2007, some of us did a 40th anniversary celebration of Sgt. Pepper. Remember that one? As you know, this is the 50th anniversary of the issuance of the White Album. Actually in November 22nd of this month, but that happens to be Thanksgiving in America, so we couldn't do it then. But we sort of thought, well, it would be kind of interesting to celebrate this music, which at least many of us here and many of you grew up with, but also because 1968 was such a kind of pivotal year, both in the United States and globally. So we thought, okay, well, let's celebrate the moment and let's have an audience talk a little bit about and discuss about how the 68 year affected us and how it left a legacy, I think, in many, many ways. So I'm going to start by just introducing Greg DeLaurier, Professor of Political Science at UMass Lowell. Paul Marion, who is a Lowell native, many of you know him. He's the poet laureate of Lowell, the biographer of Jack Kerouac, and it's great to have Paul here. Bob Ferrand, Professor of History at UMass Lowell. Bob is a labor historian, and many of you know from his work in the community and working in Lawrence. And Professor Will Moylan, who is a Professor of Music at UMass Lowell. And all of these folks are dear friends of mine. So we're going to start with Will because he knows about the music and he's going to show you some stuff about the White Album. And then we're going to go and talk a little bit about our personal experience of doing this. And I also should mention, although he's always going to be low profile, is our producer, roadie, and background guy, Jesse Hines, who's a professor of computer science. Lowell Telecommunications for their hospitality here. And also to thank UTech, who provided the food for us here, and the Departments of Political Science and Music, who provided some financial sponsorship to get some food for us. And so we thank all of them.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to sit, and, well, it looks like people might want me to stand. Can you see me okay in the back? Not really, can you? You want me to stand?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're not that old.
Well, thank you for that. I do appreciate that. So the White Album, 30 songs, 2 discs. Very unusual at the time. 1968, a double album coming out was terrifically unusual. The cover of the album was very unusual. A completely blank white album. It did come with photographs. So of these 30 songs, very many of them are in different musical styles. And that's one of the very fascinating things about the album, is if you listen to it, you go from one style to another style to another style, and it's a kaleidoscope, and it's a collage. And we have this sense that there's a lot of individual fingerprints on it, fingerprints of individuals for one musical style and another musical style. And we get, for the very first time, we get a sense of the Beatles as soloists. We have Blackbird, that's just Paul and his feet tapping, and the guitar, that's all it is. And we have Julia, that's just John and the guitar. So we're getting this sense of the Beatles becoming individuals. We're also getting a sense that they come together as a band. There's a lot that's been said about all of the tension that was going on. George Martin getting fed up with what he called the children in the schoolhouse, and he left on vacation. We had Jeff Emmerich, who had been their engineer for many years, that just got sort of tired of the tension, and he left. But I have to tell you, I cut my teeth as an engineer listening to all of the tracks. And there was joy in the recording sessions. There was happiness. There was wonderful interaction when the music was going on. So as professional musicians, when it was time to make music, they made music. And you have to remember, these 4 lads shared a basement apartment in Hamburg far too well. And that was just part of their fabric. At that point in time, they had a very, very close connection. So 1968, with the White Album, the Beatles had just come out of 1967, where they had Sgt. Pepper, where they had the Magical Mystery Tour, where they had the worldwide broadcast of All You Need Is Love, and you all remember these things. So now we have this sense that they go to India, and George Harrison has said that India is all over the White Album. That their time in India, three of them spent a lot of time writing music. And Ringo started to feel left out. And when they started making the White Album, Ringo started feeling left out. Because all of the activity was going on. They did a demo at George's house in Esher, and Ringo wasn't there. So they sat around, they shared their songs. And, well, Ringo wasn't writing songs. So he wasn't involved in that. We get a sense of how individual songs are coming together. So I wanted to play While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And I wanted to do this because it really takes a wide swath throughout this period of time. It starts off, the first track you're going to hear is the very first time George played it in the studio. And it was the very first version. It was how he imagined the piece to be. You're going to hear George singing and his guitar and a very quiet harmonium played by Paul in the background. And you're going to hear George give his lunch order.
I'll just have cheese and lettuce and Marmite sandwich and coffee. Okay, 1, 2, 3.
So at this time, 4-track tape recorders were being used. And let me explain that for just a moment, very quickly. So we had analog tape that ran from one reel to another. For a 4-track tape, the tape is divided up into 4 areas. And this is what the Beatles used for Sgt. Pepper. It's what they started using for the White Album. It's what they were using for Revolver. And we have this sense that it's not enough. Actually, they had a sense that it wasn't enough because 8-track recorders were available. And there was an 8-track recorder at Abbey Road. George Harrison had an 8-track. Paul McCartney had an 8-track. Their particular studio in Abbey Road didn't, so they had 4 tracks. 3 months later, they had an 8-track at Abbey Road because they demanded it. So the process of writing this piece went from what was going to be a ballad into what was going to be more of a rock song. And those takes for the rock song sort of fell apart. Those takes took place about a month after the original one you heard. And then they were trying to figure out what to do with it. George Harrison really had a very clear idea that he wanted certain things to happen, but it wasn't working with the band. So they brought in Eric Clapton to play on the album with them. So what you're going to see here is Eric Clapton on guitar and organ and percussion, and you're going to have various other things going on here. So this particular DVD actually allows you to hear some of these tracks without hearing the entire ensemble playing, the entire band playing. But at this point in time in 1968, we're seeing a radical shift where we have all of the individual players that can be isolated and be controlled separately. We also have a situation where everybody doesn't have to be present at the same time, and we can go back and we can change things, and that kind of time shifting changed the face of recording entirely, and it changed the face of what was going on in the recording industry and in the music industry. So the first version that you heard, George Harrison and his solo guitar, that was redone for the Cirque du Soleil performances and the Love album. And to that, George Martin added strings, and that was the last time George Martin contributed to a Beatles piece. And it's a real special recording. And if you are attracted to the Beatles, I highly advise you to look it up because it's a brand new way of hearing the Beatles. So I've got a treat for you. Tomorrow, the 50th anniversary White Album is going to be released. And we have it here tonight. So I'm going to play the brand new version of While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And as you listen to this, those of us sitting in the time capsule from 50 years ago, you're going to hear George's voice with more clarity than you've heard it before. And you're going to be able to hear very, very distinctly how he doubled the line. You'll be able to hear both of his singing of both lines going on. You're going to be able to hear the percussion with more clarity. The lines are much more defined. And in the original, George Harrison's guitar is buried in the mix. It's very clear in this particular version. And Eric Clapton in the original occupied the whole middle of the recording. Eric's off in the corner. I don't know why, but they put Eric in the corner. So he must have done something to somebody. Jesse? So how many of you remember the Ed Sullivan Show? How many of you watched when the Beatles first arrived? Yeah. What an iconic moment. And to remember that it happened just a few months after JFK's assassination, and how it just made a difference. It made a big difference. So I saw it also. It made an impact on my life. The Beatles shaped my career, and they shaped the way I look at the world from very early on. I have a peace sign on my car. It's been there since I was a teenager. And I have an All You Need Is Love button. A year ago at this time, 2 years ago at this time, I ordered about 150 All You Need Is Love buttons, and I gave them to all of my friends, and their friends, and their friends. Musically, the Beatles taught me that anything is possible, and anything is okay. And all types of music can come together, and my career as a musician has covered all genres of music, and I've recorded all genres of music, and I've performed in all genres of music. There was a point in my life where one day I was doing classical, one day I was doing jazz, in the morning I was doing pop, in the afternoon I was doing rock, and it was okay. It was absolutely okay. And in the recording studio I would do classical music one day, jazz one day, and pop one day. And that was just fine. You didn't have to specialize. You didn't have to not do something. And what I found to be most important to me was how all of the Beatles pieces had a positive message. Even the ones that were a little bit down. Like In My Life, John singing about a lost friend. Even that song had a positive twist to it. And so the Beatles have been in my career all along. I still write about the Beatles. I still use the Beatles recordings to illustrate points in my books and in my articles. They talk about how the sounds of the records are. And we have many, many versions of these Beatle pieces that come along, and now we have a new one. And I can talk about various issues, and I can compare them to recordings of the Beatles. And if I play recordings by other folks, people pass judgment. But if I play the Beatles, if they start passing judgment, I can say it's the Beatles. Get over it. It's just the Beatles. So the Beatles have been strung throughout my career. And let me tell you one last story, and then I'm going to turn over the microphone. The last recording session I did at a major recording studio in New York City was about 15 years ago. And the recording went on, and it turned out to be, the first night of the project turned out to be very unproductive, and I won't go into the details, but when I left the studio at 4 in the morning, I wasn't a happy camper. But I couldn't show the artist, I couldn't show anybody except the engineer who made me an unhappy camper was very clear about why that was. But as I was leaving the studio, it was the Hit Factory in New York City, and as I'm leaving the control room, I look over my shoulder, and there's a platinum album to Double Fantasy. And I'm thinking, well, I guess it's not so bad.
Yes.
Yeah, one thing, you had talked about how you thought the album, and I'm paraphrasing poorly, brought how the group was together. But yet, I always thought that particular song, My Guitar Gently Weeps, was really George Harrison's thoughts of how the group is actually starting to split up and go different ways. And he was upset about that.
Well, I think you need to ask George. But that's not possible anymore. Yeah, yeah. So I try not to pay too much attention to second parties and third parties. And we tend to like to make things to talk about. And it's easier to talk about things not going well than things coming together. And yes, there were a lot of interpersonal things going on. But as I said at the beginning, as I've listened to a lot of source tapes, I've listened to a lot of the session tapes, and I really, that's how I learned a lot when I was growing up in the industry. That negativism, that splitting apart, isn't on tape. So we're hearing it secondhand and third hand, and what I'm hearing on tape is mostly people having fun, and mostly people being productive. And yes, when you get creative types together, they don't say long sentences, they take short sentences. And some of those can get snippy. But I would say...
What do you think happened in India that made them go their separate ways? Was it just the meditation? But it's funny, well, they still had moments as a band where they were still good. But it seems like, you know, it kind of drove them apart as well.
I don't think it was necessarily meditation that did it. I think what we had were four folks that were growing, and they were growing apart. And in the process of growing apart, their individual identities were going in different directions. What happened in India is George very clearly recognized that drugs weren't going to expand his mind, that meditation was. And John recognized that as well. So we're getting less influence from psychedelics at that point.
Okay, I'm going to call upon my friend Paul Marion. He's going to talk to us a little bit about his experience in Lowell and growing up here and Beatles and his impact on his life.
It's interesting that Will mentioned that the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan on February 9th, 1964, just a couple of months after the assassination of President Kennedy. The White Album landed in the United States on November 22nd, which was the anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy. Just a unusual, kind of, I assume coincidence, but a little bit of an echo of what you were mentioning earlier, and the same way that the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 was a national tragedy. Lowell, as a city, as a community, in a sense, in 1968 was still in the midst of a slow motion municipal tragedy. Between 1920 and 1960, 20,000 people moved out of Lowell. The city, after World War II, was in decline because business and industry had left the city in many respects, and yet it was like a two-track story. So economically, the macroeconomics were bad. In 1968, Lowell was on its way to the lowest point, in modern history, which was 1975, when the unemployment rate was 12%. It's 3.7% now, right? So it was 12%. That was official. It was probably 25% unofficial, if you counted people who were underemployed, working under the table, working part-time and so forth. So it was very, very difficult period. Even with 20,000 people leaving the city, though, in those middle decades, there were still 92,000 people. And those 92,000 people made a functioning community. So, and there are some folks here, I know who are from Lowell, and we're here, and you know, have actually more of a first-hand experience than me, because I was born in Lowell, but I grew up in Dracut, but Lowell was like downtown Dracut. My mother worked in a women's department store. We were always in the city. Lowell was where you did all your shopping and so forth. So even in the midst of the kind of economic stress, you know, Lowell had an active and you know, fairly successful, you know, downtown business sector. There were 2 department stores and shoe stores and good quality men's and women's clothing stores. There were 2 5 and 10s. You know, all the main stores were open on Monday and Thursday nights. You know, it was a, you know, if you were living here, you know, the sort of the optics were that it wasn't a ghost town, you know, and yet the larger story was, you know, it was in deep, you know, economic trouble, and it would take another 10 years, you know, between 68 and 78 for, you know, the economy, you know, the microeconomy, but also the, you know, the state and the region to come back, you know, in a sort of larger sense, because of the computer industry coming along, and Bob knows a lot more about this than I do. But locally, excuse me, 1978, the National Park was created. The university was merged out of 2 colleges in 1975. You know, there were a number of sort of major things that happened that sort of shook Lowell, you know, out of its decline and got things moving again. But just a word about the sort of the culture of the city. In the mid-60s, there was a very active rock venue, the Commodore Ballroom. The Doors played there in 1967 when Light My Fire was the #1 song in the country. The Kinks played there, Jimi Hendrix, Cream, Clapton played there, Jimmy Page with the Yardbirds. I mean, it was big, you know, they, you know, they're legendary now, but, you know, they were popular in the moment, and Lowell, you know, was enough of a attraction in terms of a venue that they were all stopping in Lowell, you know. So there was a very active sort of music consumer, you know, culture. There were 2 successful record stores, Garnick's and Record Lane, and the AM music stations, you know, played the you know, the top hits and so forth. So you know, when you know, the Beatles never came to Lowell, you know, but you know, they came to Boston twice, and you know, people from, you know, I knew somebody, you know, from Dracut who actually saw them, and I know a guy who grew up in Tewksbury who went to see them the second time they came through Boston. So, you know, Lowell, you know, was in a place to receive the Beatles as an active, you know, community. But there were a lot of stresses and strains. I think, you know, some of the other speakers will talk about some of the political conflicts that were going on that manifested itself in Lowell. You know, during that period, 1969-70, there were 2 major anti-war marches. One of them in the fall of 1969 was a large march in solidarity with the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam, which had, you know, cities all over the country participating. In Boston, 100,000 people came to hear Senator George McGovern. And then in 1970, there was another anti-war march that was more edgy, you know, in the way it manifested itself. The 1969 march was largely peaceful. In 1970, organizers around the state were starting to try to get people in cities like Lowell, the older industrial cities, which were providing a lot of the soldiers for the war. They were trying to stoke up interest for people in those cities to kind of push back. And there was a major march that occurred, but it encountered tremendous resistance, from local Lowell working class guys who reacted very badly to some of the banners, and there was a Viet Cong flag, and it produced essentially a riot as a result of the clash of the local people and the demonstrators. I'm going to wrap up now and turn it over to the next.
To show you how devoted a Beatle fan I was, I grew up in a very small working class town in upstate New York, way up there. But the thing of it was, Ottawa, capital of Canada, our neighbors to the north, I think we like them, don't we? Right? Was only an hour away, and they had everything. They had all the imported albums from the Beatles. They had everything, and they had Beatle clothes. So I bought a Beatles jacket. Remember the ones with the collarless ones? And I wore it to school. And I promptly got the shit kicked out of me very well and had my sexuality questioned, as happened before. So that's one memory. In 1968, I was in college with a .8 GPA. And if you think about it, that's not easy to do. You have to work pretty hard at doing nothing to get a .8. In fact, I got a letter from, at the time I got a letter from the chairman of the department congratulating me on getting one of the lowest GPAs that the department ever had. It was tongue-in-cheek, but in 1968, kind of more seriously, I was lost. I was 18 years old and I didn't know anything. But 1968 was not all lightness and kindness, and as those who our peers know, that 1968 was a brutal year. And leaders were dying. Civil rights leaders were dying. A war was going on that nobody understood. Death was everywhere. And every week, 200, 250 more American soldiers were coming home in boxes. And one of them was one of my best friends. And I'm 18 years old and I have to go to a funeral home. And there's my friend dead in a box with his Marine uniform on, 18 years old. I went to fill up the family car, which was some kind of Pontiac, which was 190 feet long. And I filled the car up with gas and went in to pay my $3. And on a more serious note, the cashier was another friend of mine, and he had one arm. He had had his arm blown off in Vietnam. So I'm 18, and I'm saying, what the is going on here? And what I think was going on in hindsight, and I remember thinking this, is look, there's two ways we can go here. There's a culture of death out there, and your politics may not be my politics, but I got the microphone, so it's okay. You can have it when it's your turn. But I remember very clearly saying, there's two cultures here. There's one of death, there's one of destruction, there's one of Vietnam, there's one of the young men and women coming home in a box, and then there's life, and there's love, and there's buttons, and all you need is love. And there was, above all else, the music. And I was tied to these guys, and I was tied to all of you who are my age. I didn't know you, but I felt you. And what was the glue that held us together? It was the music. And the music was so important. And when we say the music, yes, there were a lot of good bands. The Doors, sorry, there's a personal opinion. But above all else, there was the Beatles. Okay? So, you haven't held up a sign yet. I'm holding up a sign here. I need to get off stage here. But I want to get you all involved, and we're going to sing a couple songs. I tried this in my class with the young punk kids I teach, 2 of which are here out of 100, not bad. So we're going to do a sing-along. Okay, I want everybody to clap their hands. How about at the same beat? We all live in a One more time. We all live in a yellow submarine. A yellow submarine. A yellow submarine. That's enough, that's enough. We are sailing. The youngsters in Ireland to go. Oh, we are.
When we sang Yellow Submarine, I actually sang it at a demonstration. We changed the words to "We all live in a concentration camp." This was when we were in Washington, D.C., trying to levitate the Pentagon. It didn't work. Yeah. For me, the music was always a backdrop to political turmoil that was taking place across 1968, 1969, 1970, into the early 70s. And the music, for me, when I think about it, it always reminds me of politics and various things that were going on. And within the group of friends that I had, we would fight, in terms of the music, we would fight about who was better, the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. And so I always picked the Rolling Stones because I thought they were tougher. And I thought the Beatles were just kind of nice. So I always, if in a fight, Rolling Stones, and when I lived in Boston in 1968, 1968 starts with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which is the first time on the nightly news that people in the United States begin to think maybe things aren't going the way everybody at the higher levels of American government are telling us about the war. Maybe it's not as easy, and maybe we're not winning. Maybe there's something else happening here that we're not quite aware of. And so that's followed quickly by a guy named Eugene McCarthy, who's a senator from Minnesota, who decides to do something unthinkable at the time, challenge a sitting president of his own party. So McCarthy's a Democrat, Lyndon Johnson's a Democrat. Lyndon Johnson's riding high, escalating the war in Vietnam with his Secretary of War, I called him at the time, McNamara. And so McCarthy basically comes to Boston. I'm a student in Boston, and he comes to Boston, and he says, how many of you will go with me and door knock in New Hampshire and talk about why the war is wrong and why we need to get out of Vietnam? And having grown up in Beverly, Massachusetts, and spent a lot of time in New Hampshire, I thought this is an interesting challenge to go door knocking in New Hampshire about the war in Vietnam. And so I showed up at a meeting that was held for people who might want to go to New Hampshire. And at the time, I had a ponytail about 7.5 inches down my back. And I walked in, and the people around McCarthy said, you can't go to New Hampshire. And I said, why? And they said, because unless you're willing to get clean for Gene, you cannot go to New Hampshire. We don't want people that look like you walking the streets of New Hampshire. And so I had one of these first crises of sort of appearance versus what did I actually believe in. And so I went home and shaved and cut my hair, went home that weekend, and my mother fell in love with Eugene McCarthy. And so I went and door knocked in New Hampshire. McCarthy did exceedingly well in the primary in New Hampshire, to the point that then Robert Kennedy decided to jump into the race. Those of us that had been for McCarthy didn't like the fact that Robert Kennedy jumped in. We thought he was coming in late. He wasn't willing to take the first stand as McCarthy had. But at any rate, he now jumps in, and fairly quickly, by the end of March, Lyndon Johnson announces he's not going to run again. While all that's happening in late March and early April, Martin Luther King is assassinated. The war is escalating. The war is still going badly. In June, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. And I was watching TV when that happened. And so the returns were coming in from the California primary on that evening. And he is looking like the victor, and he comes down to make a speech. They televise the speech. He's walking away. And if you were watching, you could hear everybody screaming and you could hear people yelling that Robert Kennedy had been shot. And so the soundtrack to all of that, for me, again, is the music that we've been listening to tonight. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Jefferson Airplane, Cream, any number of groups. We would try to figure out how we felt and put music on in some way to try to think this thing through. The music also was something that boosted our spirits when we went to demonstrations or rallies. I would always, in Boston, before going to a march or a demonstration, put on the Rolling Stones Street Fighting Man, as though I was this big tough guy that was going to go out there and fight in the streets, not. But it was something that sort of got the adrenaline up and got everybody moving. So the culmination, in a way, of all of this stuff for me in that year, the turmoil of 1968, is that I went to the convention in Chicago, the 1968 Democratic Party convention, which was in Chicago, and it was part Culture Fest, part anti-war demonstration, part police riot, complete and utter unbelievable chaos in the streets of the city of Chicago, but there was also a soundtrack, which is the music that we were listening to during this period of time. I got my head caved in Chicago. I think how much more brilliant I would be if I had not been hit. But nonetheless, the music was the way I think that people coped with that year, because there was no, you know, when you're living through it, again, sort of, it's interesting being a historian and looking back and trying to think about living through it, because when you're living through it, you don't necessarily think it's that big of a deal. But when I step away and think about all the things that happened in that particular year, as well as the music, the culture, everything else that was going on, it was really one of these transformative kinds of years in the history of the country. I bought the album in Harvard Square at the Harvard Coop. And as I recall, I think it cost me like $3.85 or something like that. But there was a line at the record store to get it. I I got on the subway. I lived in downtown Boston. And we couldn't wait to play it and criticize it, as we also always did when we listened to this kind of music. But again, for me, also retrospectively, when I listen now, or I hear, or I put this on a record player I have at home, I'm immediately transformed backwards. There's something about certain music that I can almost tell you where I was when that song was playing in my brain, when I was trying to levitate the Pentagon, or whatever I was thinking I was going to do on the streets of Chicago in 1968. But there's probably not been anything like the phenomenon of the British invasion. I won't just say the Beatles, of that whole era of music coming over. Again, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, Cream. Have to throw Ireland in there, Northern Ireland with Van Morrison. I mean, there's a whole host of music that is inescapable in defining who I am, and probably for a lot of us in here, who we are as well. Thank you.
One thing that you may not know is that we were all worried about getting drafted. And
Some of us did.
Yeah. Well, some of us didn't have .08 GPAs. So.
Now you tell me.
And so what the government did was they had a lottery so that you would know where you were in every year. They went up to somewhere around halfway to the lottery. So it was by your birth date. They selected by your birth date. There, of course, there are 365 days in a year. And so you knew that if your number was less than like 150, you're probably going to get drafted. And it was a very stressful time, obviously. And one of the most amazing things my father ever said to me that I couldn't believe, I was in college, I graduated college in 1970, and my father, his parents were immigrants. My father was born in this country, and he lived through World War II and all that patriotism. And my father told me to go to Canada, which was the most amazing thing my father ever said to me, you know. So anyway, I don't want to take a lot of time, but If you look that up, you can find it and you can see what the numbers were for each year. And my number, I know, and it's one of those things you don't forget. My number was 90. You know, my number was 90.
62.
You were 62. You see, it's 4. You were 4. Wow. So I mean, you see how we all remember what our numbers were. You see, because obviously it was a phenomenally important thing to us. So.
I happened to be a student right here at Lowell in 1968. And so I can remember those marches that you referred to when all of the students who chose to would pour out of Lowell. I was on South Campus, which was Lowell Teachers College, State Teachers College at the time. And they would just pour into the streets and join these marches. There were many times you'd go to lunch in the cafeteria, which at the time was in the bottom of like where the O'Leary Library is, that big. I don't know what's there now. And many times you'd be over there at lunchtime or whatever, and there would be what you knew were paid agitators and organizers. And they would have a microphone, and they would be gearing people up and getting people riled to go into these marches and things. From the music perspective, Lowell brought in quite a few names itself. I can remember going to see the Four Seasons, A Lovin' Spoonful, the Turtles, and there was one more. I don't think it was the Cream. Was there another one that was vanilla? Vanilla Ice. Vanilla Ice. Anyway,
All these groups were at the Commodore. And,
No, this was right at Lowell. This was not at the Commodore.
Oh, at school, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, that's my comments just from being here in
So
1960.
I grew up in England. I grew up with the Beatles. I was fortunate enough to be a young kid. In '68, I was only 15. And a more general comment is that for me personally, I was a son of a coal delivery driver. I was a working class kid. And until the beginning of the 60s, until the Beatles came on the scene, roughly in '63, '64, we never heard people with my accent on the radio or TV. It was BBC English, and I can't really tell you how transformational that was for me to see these, especially these four, the Beatles, being who they were on radio and on TV, when I felt very much the sort of the oppression of class in England. And so that was a big part of this for me. And when I was 10 or 11, go to the next slide, please, Jess. I'd like to show you a slide. Okay, this is a poster from when the Beatles played in my hometown in Northampton, a concert I went to with my brother, which I don't really remember much about because I was only 10. But as you can see, they're at the bottom of the post. I've been telling Paul Marion for years that the Rolling Stones wrote double bill on here. But it wasn't the Rolling Stones. It was
Tommy Rowe and the Rolling Stones.
Tommy Rowe. It was Tommy Rowe. And my brother took me to this concert. I do remember a little bit about it. I wish my brother still had the program, because you know how much that would be worth now. You know? Next slide for a second. And this is inside that concert hall. This was actually a cinema in my hometown, Northampton, called the ABC, which I went to many times later on. And this was a picture taken. I found this on a blog of somebody who was actually at the conference just recently. Next slide for a second.
That's John with the glasses.
Yeah, and that's them in the.
That's John.
It's not me, no. I was only about this high. Okay, and these guys, this is them performing in that concert, and this is just the outside of that hall. So that's the beginning of the start. And I growing up in England with the Beatles, and when I was about 12, I started having a paper route. And I remember hearing for the first time, I Want to Hold Your Hand on the radio, and the BBC would begin to play that, but there were also pirate radio stations because the BBC wasn't allowed to play, so didn't play many things. We were a little limited in England, but it was in black and white in England in 1963, because the 50s were not pretty tough. But the 60s were also a moment in England politically and culturally that really was transformational. I was fortunate enough to be growing up in the middle of that, right? In 1964, the Labour Party returned to power in England. They were very socially progressive and liberal. I grew up in a welfare state in England because of the Labour Party, because of social democracy. But they legalized homosexual relationships in 1967. Abortion became free and legal in 1967, 68 in England. And the concerns in England were different from the concerns here. In 1966, 2 years before 68, Britain, for the last time I can remember, won the World Cup. We beat the Germans. That was like payback time. Harold Wilson was the Prime Minister, and I remember that very distinctly. And the next slide, please, Jess. And there was a lot of really good music, right? Remember Donovan? Obviously, the Rolling Stones at the top. On the right, Van Morrison, Greg mentioned him, and he the Moondance. No, Astral Weeks came out in 1968, I think. Astral Weeks, which was very interesting. And then the young woman down the bottom there, Mary Hopkin. Anybody remember her? Who would like to sing "Those Were the Days, My Friend," right? She won. And she was one of the, I think she was the first singer-songwriter produced by Apple, because Apple Corp was formed in 1968 in England, right? And Paul McCartney nurtured her and produced the records for her. I actually thought he wrote Those Were the Days, but he did not. But for me personally, again, in 1967, saving up my money for my paper route, I bought Sgt. Pepper. In 1968, I had a job working in the first fast food American-style cafe in my hometown called the Wimpy Bar. Really, that was his name. I used to work there at weekends, and I saved up enough money to buy the White Album when it came out, 32 and sixpence, a fortune for me at that point in time. I don't have my actual original because I sold it to Dave Perry. He's got it now, but I have the original one. And what I remember about that year was because I was 15, it was a really good year, and I was dating Eileen Elliott, who lived about 5 miles out of my hometown. And I remember when I got the album, bicycling to her house so we could listen to music together, and bicycling back. It's a 10-mile round trip. And I don't think we ever got past first base. I mean, really, it was a long time we were doing this stuff. Next slide, please. So, and I was listening to these bands too, which, do you remember The Who? I mean, The Who were I was a very big Who fan back in 1968. They were just writing, Pete Townsend was writing Tommy, the opera. So, the flavor of music was changing a lot in England. Manfred Mann were a huge band. And of course, The Cream. In 1970, I skipped out of school and went and hitchhiked down to London to watch The Cream play at the country club in London. I was this far from Eric Clapton. You can touch me later, right? So I had a good fortune, and my other favorite band were the Kinks, who played my hometown a lot. And actually later on, many, many years later, I actually was standing in a bar next to Ray Davies.
And you were spit on by Johnny Rotten.
I was spit on by Johnny Rotten later when the punk rock movement came about. But, at the Hope and Anchor in Islington, in London. But I had this incredibly rich experience of this kind of music and these political events that were going on there, being in the Labour Party, really sort of liberating the culture. The Beatles, of course, were incredibly critical to this in England. I mean, you all loved them, and you all loved the British invasion. I mean, it was an incredibly, for a moment there, a short and brief, shining moment. Britain, culturally and politically, was a very interesting place to be in. And it was a soundtrack to my youth. But we were, less focused on the Vietnam War. I mean, we puzzled about Americans a lot. I think I said this to my class here, that I remember John Lennon coming back for the first trip to America, being interviewed on the BBC, and we were all fascinated by America, because we saw some of the TV. And I remember the reporter asking, what's America like? And he said, well, it's like England, but there are more buttons to push. Which is more scientifically developed. The next slide, please. But also the downside of this was there was a lot of concern beginning in 68 with immigration. Because in England, what was happening there was all of the former colonies of England were being decolonized, becoming independent. So there was a lot of really positive immigration into England. But this fella, Enoch Powell, who was then the shadow cabinet member for the secretary, what you would call the secretary of state, our home secretary, very famously made this speech saying, if immigration continues this way, there will be rivers of blood in England. And it became called the Rivers of Blood speech. I remember that very distinctly because I was listening to the White House when he said this. He later had to resign because of what he'd said, but it led to a very, very discriminatory anti-immigration legislation in England in 1968. It was the beginning of a lot of the troubles that then emerged later on, including the emergence of right-wing groups called the National Front. And I bring it up because there are parallels to today. With the immigration coming in, Britain then going through lots of cultural changes and also fear of economic decline in England. This led to this sort of xenophobic response to this, it was very profound. We saw about the Beatles, maybe the fractures in the Beatles beginning, but there's also a fracture, sort of interesting because the way music was developing in England with Yes and Genesis and Tommy, you get into this sort of rock opera over-processed stuff, and there's the beginnings about a year or two later of the punk rock movement emerging out of that, beginning to challenge that kind of stuff. And some of that later on gets connected to sort of the National Front and sort of anti-racist ideas. When I finally get to university in the early parts of the 1970s, I remember working with Clash and the Rock Against Racism movement later on in the mid-70s, where that becomes more and more profound. And of course, that sort of orgasmically ends up with Margaret Thatcher getting elected in 1979 and Britain becoming much more like Enoch Powell. Some of this, of course, for us in 1968, what was going on the other side of the channel for us was France. And we were much more focused on that listening to the White Album, because the French May Day movement, the student revolt, basically brought down the government. It led to massive cultural changes, and there's some images of what was going on there. When students went on strike and then were joined by almost all workers in France, this was not about Vietnam. This was about a revolt against capitalism in fundamental ways. And so it's a really important movement. And I always loved I don't know whether you can read this, but the translation of the "Be Realistic, Demand the Impossible" slogan that came out of this was actually created by an incredibly interesting avant-garde spin-off of the French moment in May Day called the Situationists. And you go look them up because they did some really interesting art, design, graffiti, and thinking about this. Next slide, please. And the other thing that I remember a lot was Czechoslovakia. The Dubček regime in Czechoslovakia had liberated a lot from the Soviet Union, and then in the middle of the White Album, just before the White Album came out, the Soviets invaded the Czech Republic in Czechoslovakia and suppressed the uprising. And it's memorable to me because I remember these pictures. Look at the next shot. Of students and workers fighting in front of, literally sitting on the tanks of the Soviet Union, trying to resist this invasion of their country and the quashing of the rebellion. And in particular, in the next shot, if I could just, which is this, it was actually a picture, it's hard to look at. I remember distinctly the name Jan Palach. He was a young man who immolated himself in reaction to the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. So these were also parts of the themes of my background of growing up in England. But, I was incredibly fortunate. I had the Beatles. For most of my teenage years, I listened to that music, right? And it's had an enormous impact on me politically and socially. And I'll just give you one other thought, which I've told a couple of people before, and I mentioned when we did the thing on Sgt. Pepper, was that one of the symbols of this for me was, that when you see these pictures of John Lennon today with the little round glasses on, those little round glasses were the glasses you got, if you're like me, you were a working class kid, on the National Health Service. And it always sort of marked you out as somebody who came from a poor family. They weren't very attractive. John Lennon puts them on, and they become incredibly cool. It was that kind of thing that made the difference, right? Thank you.
7, maybe even 5, my dad played the Beatles for me when I was first discovering what music even was and giving a damn about it, and it just kind of shaped who I was, sort of. It's been my favorite band for such a long time. I took a school field trip to the New England Aquarium. My dad took a video of it and put Yellow Submarine and Octopus's Garden over it, and I still remember that. So it's just a very, even now, but so many years later, it's just still a part of life and culture, and it can just still mean a lot to to the generations that come next. And just that kind of shows the staying power of what these 4 guys started. And I mean, my first album, audio.
That's really important for us because we think we're just obsessing with this and we're old people, but that you love the Beatles is really great. Yeah.
Again, for Beatle obsessives, the way Paul McCartney has put that on his playlist in the past 10 years. And it's he's very assertively reclaimed the song, knowing, what happened to it, that it got hijacked in the popular culture, particularly in America. And he's really been, very aggressive in a sense, by playing the song, concert after concert after concert for the past 10 years. And I think in some ways has rehabilitated, the connotation, because so many people have seen him now playing it, which the Beatles never played it, right? They never played it live.
So, I mean, one of the things that I think happens, right? It's somewhat, we're celebrating this particular album, but I think in a lot of ways the culture takes a darker turn after 1968, 1969, 1970. You end up with the Rolling Stones concert at Altamont, where somebody is killed. Yeah, I mean, so the question before about like what happened to the Beatles or whatever, I mean, I think a lot of things that people thought the music signified, and peace and love, and we can all get along, and all of that sort of stuff. By 1969, 1970, that's really starting to fall apart. 1970, you have Kent State, 4 students are killed. You have Jackson State, African-American black college, where students are killed. You have massive student strikes in 1970. Everything that, again, for me, living through it, everything that I thought was going to happen, that the revolution was here, that we were going to come out the other side with this incredible social, political, cultural shift and change. By 1970, when I'm graduating from college, all of that seems to me to have gone away. And as I'm graduating in 1970, most college campuses are on strike. Students are refusing to take their final exams, refusing to go to class. I get thrown out of my college graduation for trying to rush the stage with a bunch of students to get a student speaker to say something about the war and about Kent State and Jackson State and what's happening. And I do feel like the music, again, to me, living through it, that the possibility of listening to that album or other music at the time seems to me to have the moment passes. And I don't, everybody has a different take, right? Depending on how old you were or what you were doing or whatever. But again, for me, as a person in the moment, living in Boston, having lived through all the student strikes and marches and protests in Boston, having gone to Washington many times, Chicago, it really did seem like the string had run out, and that what it was that people had been working on and trying to do wasn't going to happen. And coming to grips with that, for a lot of people, some people just went off the rails. The anti-war movement splinters into very violent factions. There's a townhouse where people are making bombs in New York City that blows up. I mean, there's a lot of just crazy stuff that happens. Plus, you get Nixon and I mean, it really, it becomes, again, from this high of the music and everything we've been celebrating to, man, this just doesn't seem like it's going to work out. And, I mean, I feel, again, thinking about it as a teacher, I feel like we're at another one of those places where we had the high of Obama and 8 years of thinking, yeah, we finally figured out how to deal with this race question in America somewhat. I never thought it was finished, but somewhat. We've started to work on it. And I feel like now it just reminds me of Enoch Powell and George Wallace, and here we are in 1968 all over again. So while I love the music also then brings this other stuff into my brain, right? The historian part of me can't shut that off.
We put this together for fun. It's also part of, as I say in the introduction, our efforts to create this idea of Lowell as a city of learning, so that we have more events downtown that bring faculty that are for fun, where we're talking about our lives and personal experiences, not being abstract and distant. And I think that this is a good start. Well, as some of you may have known, back in April we did a pilot festival of learning. We're going to do that. We're going to make Lowell a UNESCO City of Learning, called the Lowell Learning City, where the walls break down and